Have you ever heard about a Japanese colonel who once whispered to his men, "We can't train like them. We just don't have what they have"? You'd think he was talking about American special forces or some elite European soldiers. But no, he was talking about Filipino soldiers. At first, that sounds strange, right? A country known more for kindness and smiles than for war being praised by one of the most disciplined armies on earth. But what this colonel saw on a small island changed how he viewed strength, courage, and loyalty forever. He saw something you don't learn in boot camps or from fancy weapons. He saw men who fought with heart not because they were ordered to, but because they refused to leave anyone behind. And that spirit shook him. Because real strength isn't always loud sometimes, it whispers. The story began during a joint military drill, Japanese and Filipino soldiers training together in the heat of a jungle. At first, the Japanese soldiers thought the Filipinos were too relaxed, too casual. They joked around, laughed during breaks, even shared food. But when training got tough, when the rain fell hard, the ground turned to mud, and exhaustion kicked in, something changed. The Filipino troops didn't slow down. They carried each other, cheered each other on, and never left anyone behind. If one man slipped, another reached out his hand. If one fell, two others lifted him up. The Japanese colonel watched in silence. He'd seen soldiers break before, but these men, they didn't break. They smiled through pain, laughed through fear, and pushed forward like brothers. And that's when he whispered, "We can't train like them." That night, the colonel couldn't sleep. He sat outside his tent, listening to the rain hit the roof, thinking about what he saw. He'd spent more than 20 years teaching soldiers how to fight. But tonight, he realized he'd seen something no textbook could explain. The Filipino soldiers didn't just fight for their country, they fought for each other. It wasn't about pride, medals, or orders. It was about loyalty, love, and sacrifice. He remembered watching one soldier give his last bottle of water to another who was about to collapse. No hesitation, no question, just quiet, human kindness in the middle of war games. And in that moment, the colonel understood something powerful. You can train muscles, you can teach tactics, but you can't train heart. You're either born with it, or you're not. The next morning, Colonel Hidetaka decided to test what he saw. He planned a surprise endurance drill, one that even his own Japanese troops often failed. He wanted to see if the Filipino soldiers would still give their all when no one was watching. The sun was already burning hot. The ground was muddy from last night's rain. Each soldier had to carry heavy packs, run uphill, and crawl under barbed wire. Most armies would slow down. Some would quit, but not them. He watched in shock as the Filipino soldiers pushed forward laughing, shouting, "Kaya natin too," which means, "We can do this." Even when one soldier twisted his ankle, two others lifted him up and kept running. No one left anyone behind. No one stopped. By the end, every single one finished the drill. Soaked, dirty, bleeding but smiling. The colonel couldn't believe it. He whispered, "They don't train for survival. They train for each other." That night, the colonel sat by a small fire with a few Filipino soldiers. They laughed while cleaning their muddy boots and shared stories about their families. One of them said quietly, "Sir, my wife prays for me every night." Another added, "Mine too, but I pray for strength, not safety." The colonel looked confused. "Why not safety?" he asked. The soldier smiled and said, "Because if we're strong enough to do what's right, God will handle the rest." That line hit the colonel hard. In Japan, soldiers were trained to control emotion. But here, emotion was their strength. They prayed before missions, not to live, but to serve. Not to avoid pain, but to have courage to face it. And for the first time in his long career, the colonel realized something he'd never been taught. Faith can be armor too. After that night, the colonel started writing. Every evening, by the dim light of a small lamp, he filled his notebook with what he saw. He wrote, "Is greater than Filipino soldiers don't fight because they're ordered to. They fight because they choose to." He wrote about the soldier who gave away his boots to a barefoot child. About the mothers who waited at home, proud but worried. About the way every man treated his unit like family. Soon, his notebook was full of stories, not of battles, but of hearts. He realized he was no longer just an observer. He had become a witness. Every story he wrote made him question what true strength really meant. Was it perfect weapons? Was it fancy uniforms? Or was it something invisible, something you feel when people fight for love, not orders? The colonel began traveling across the Philippines. He went to Luzon, Visayas, and finally back to Mindanao. Everywhere he went, he saw the same thing: soldiers who trained hard, even with old gear and little rest, but never lost their smiles. In Baguio, he met young cadets running through cold fog at dawn. Their faces were tired, their boots soaked, but they still joked and sang songs while training. He asked an old officer, why do they laugh while running in pain? The man smiled and said, when you grow up with hardship, laughter becomes your armor. That answer stayed in the colonel's heart. He wrote in his notebook again, is greater than, in Japan, we master form. In the Philippines, they master fire. But the colonel also saw the hard side. Not everything was glory. He met soldiers with scars not just on their bodies, but in their hearts. One young lieutenant told him how he once had to stitch his own wound during a mission because there was no medic. Another man showed him a photo of his friend who never came back. And one widow, still wearing her husband's dog tags, told him he promised he'd be home for our daughter's birthday. Now she wears his cap every night. The colonel felt his chest tighten. These weren't just fighters, they were people who carried pain quietly. No cameras, no medals, just duty. In Japan, soldiers were honored with big ceremonies. Here, many were never even mentioned. Yet they still served not for fame, but for love. And that's when the colonel realized, true courage isn't loud, it's silent, and it keeps going. One evening, the colonel joined the soldiers for their nightly prayer. He didn't understand all the words, but he felt the power in their voices. They bowed their heads not in fear, but in faith. They sang softly, their hands over their hearts. It wasn't about asking for safety, it was about strength and purpose. He watched them pray for their brothers, their families, and for peace in their country. And for the first time, Colonel Hidetaka felt something he couldn't explain, a warmth in his chest, a mix of respect and awe. He wrote in his notebook that night, is greater than, discipline builds a soldier, but faith builds a warrior. From then on, he didn't see them as just troops, he saw them as protectors of hope. People who believed that even in pain, love was worth fighting for. The next day, the colonel stood beside General Cortez, the Filipino commander who hosted him. The sun was setting, painting the sky orange and gold. Below them, soldiers were training tired, sweaty, but still full of life. The colonel said quietly, your men train like no one I've ever seen. They're not forced to do it. They want to. Why? The general looked at him for a long moment, then said, because, Colonel, they know what it means to fight for a home that still needs healing. And they know if they don't stand, who will? Those words hit the colonel like thunder. It wasn't about orders anymore. It was about love. Love for a country that was still learning to rise. He finally understood. They weren't just soldiers. They were guardians of hope. When the training ended, the colonel went back to Japan. But something inside him had changed. His fellow officers noticed it right away. The man who used to speak in short, cold words now spoke with warmth and respect whenever he mentioned the Philippines. During a private meeting, a young officer asked, Sir, which country do you think has the strongest soldiers in Southeast Asia? The colonel didn't even blink. The Philippines, he said. The room went silent. Another officer laughed a little. You mean tactically, sir? Or logistically? The colonel paused and said, spiritually. Everyone stared. But then he showed them photos of Filipino soldiers carrying injured civilians through floodwater, still smiling. He showed them videos of endurance drills, no one quitting, no one complaining. And when he read a letter from a young Filipino private that said, thank you for seeing our hearts, the whole room went quiet again. After that meeting, everything changed for the colonel. He couldn't keep what he saw to himself. He started giving talks at Japan's Defense Academy, not about weapons or tactics, but about heart. He told stories of Filipino soldiers who shared food with children, who carried their friends through mud, who prayed before every mission. He called them the warriors the world forgot to see. Soon, his words spread across Asia. Military officers from America, Australia, and Korea sent him messages saying, yes, we've served with Filipinos, and they never give up. One letter, from an old Japanese general who once fought in the Philippines during World War II, said, is greater than, when I was young, I feared the Filipino soldier. Now, I honor him. The colonel realized this story wasn't just about war, it was about humanity. And for the first time in his career, he wasn't just teaching soldiers how to fight, he was teaching them how to feel. Years later, the colonel returned to the Philippines. But this time, he wore no medals, no rank on his shoulders, just a plain white shirt and an old camera. He visited the same training field where he first met the soldiers. The place was quiet now, the trees taller, the air still. He smiled softly, whispering, "Still strong, still standing." A young Filipino soldier recognized him and ran over. "Sir, are you Colonel Tanaka?" He nodded, surprised anyone still knew his name. The soldier grinned and said, "My father trained under you. He said you taught him not just how to fight, but how to love his country." The colonel's eyes filled with tears. He took a deep breath and looked around at the flag waving, at the laughter of new recruits in the distance. "Tell your father," he said, "he was the one who taught me." Before he left the Philippines, the colonel visited a small school near the camp. He saw children running barefoot, laughing, waving small paper flags. He gave them his old military hat, the one he'd worn for 20 years, and said, "Keep this. It once belonged to a man who thought strength came from power, but now I know real strength comes from kindness." That night, he wrote one last letter before flying home. It said, "Is greater than, to the Filipino soldier, you showed me that courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it prays. Sometimes it carries. Sometimes it smiles through pain." When the letter was shared online years later, it went viral. Millions read it. Thousands cried. And from that day, the world no longer saw the Filipino soldier as just a fighter, but as a symbol of heart.